I'm Scott.
I'm Bill.
And we're the Trade Guys.
You're listening to The Trade Guys, a podcast produced by CSIS where we talk about trade in terms that everyone can understand. I'm H. Andrew Schwartz, and I'm here with Scott Miller and Bill Reinsch, the CSIS Trade Guys.
This is Trade Guy Scott. Welcome back to the first episode of The Trade Guys for 2025. This week, Bill and I discuss U.S.-China trade policy, the recent announcement about Nippon Steel and U.S. Steel's proposed merger, and the debate over H1-B visas. All this and more on today's episode of The Trade Guys.
Hello, Trade Guys. We are back in a new year, one that promises to bring a lot of excitement in the trade world. Of course, we'll have a new administration coming in just a week from when this podcast comes out, and we will be here to react to developments there, as we do expect there to be. I do want to start, though, with an issue that we're likely to see a decent amount of carryover from the Biden admin, and that's China. The president-elect has notably threatened to raise tariffs on China, as we've discussed ad nauseum before. Interestingly, though, China has been active on the trade front in recent months, including bans on the export of gallium, germanium, and antimony to the U.S. in December. And just last week, they added 28 U.S. entities to an export control list and 10 more to an unreliable entities list. So, guys, what's the motivation behind these recent moves, and what do you expect in terms of ramifications?
Well, first, Evan's done part of my job for me, which is great, by describing what they've done. And he raised an important pronunciation issue, which we have not been able to resolve here at Shoal Chair Central, which is it antimony or is it antimony? Evan went with antimony, so will I, but my heart is with antimony, just for the record. Some listener, if you want to send an email in and tell us what the correct pronunciation is, that will save us from future embarrassment. I think what we're seeing here is a series of shots across the bow. Export controls on stuff that we need critically, putting companies on China's naughty list. They have a naughty list just like we have several naughty lists. The investigation of Micron, these are all things, not all of them new. Gallium and germanium restrictions go back to actually 2023, as I recall. But they're all reminders, I think, subtle or not so subtle, take your pick, that China is deeply involved in U.S. supply chains, including critical U.S. supply chains that affect, critical U.S. technologies, including chips, among other things. Antimony has other uses as well. It's used in batteries, but also night vision goggles, nuclear weapon production, flame retardants. So gallium and germanium mostly go into chips, but these are all dual-use things. I think it's just a message to the Americans that, you can do what you want to do to us, but there's things we can do to you that will make things very inconvenient for you. And I use the word inconvenient deliberately because when the initial controls on gallium and germanium were put in place, we looked at that rather closely and concluded that, and I think we said on the podcast, that the effects were inconvenient but not fatal, that there are other producers. And in fact, in the intervening period since that happened, apparently the United States has really stopped buying gallium and germanium from China. The antimony restriction is far newer, so I don't have a lot of data on that. But it is inconvenient, but it's a mixed bag of inconvenience. The price effect has been inconsistent, would be the best way to put it. The germanium price went up dramatically, almost doubling, but then has started to come down. The gallium price has been more or less flat throughout this entire period. It went up a little bit, it went down a little bit. It's pretty much where it's been from the beginning. The antimony price has gone up sharply, but whether it stays up, too soon to say, we'll see. But none of this is fatal, but it's a reminder that, we really do live in a globally integrated economy, and that if you believe in decoupling, the word of 2024, it's not a painless process, that you can do that, I guess, and you can unwind, but there are going to be price effects and there are going to be availability effects, and companies that rely on Chinese production for selected products are going to be impacted. And the message from China is, you ought to think about that before you take further action. Now, is Trump going to think about that? My guess is probably not, but, we'll see. Scott?
Well, Bill, I think you're right about China's behaviors here. I would note that I think a lot has changed in 4 years in terms of the elements that are particularly delicate or sensitive in our relationship with China and the things we're trying to accomplish and what China's trying to accomplish. that's not a surprise that it's that way. But I was thinking back on the trade agenda in the first Trump term and recalled that most of the action on China was about unfair practices. It was really focused on much more sort of trade-related issues rather than the security dimensions that come out in chip technology and dual-use products. So it was the Section 301 investigation that led to the investigation of unfair practices, that led to the phases. Now, you can argue whether that worked or not, but the more important point is that things are different now. The problems are in different places. The issues on which there is tension are different. And to my mind, it's much more in the area of national security matters and production of the highest technology goods. So I think that even though that Trump has 4 years in office and a history of this, he and his team are likely to come in and look at it fresh and think about things in a more comprehensive way. The second point I'd make is much like President Reagan relied on a comprehensive look at the Soviet Union when he pushed his agenda, he had a very simple goal. I mean, Reagan's goal was, we win, they lose, all right, which served him well. But the other thing is he always negotiated from strength. I always thought Reagan was an excellent negotiator, and his skill was developed early on when he was an actor. He was president of the Screen Actors Guild. And if you compare like Jack Warner and some of these studio moguls who Reagan was negotiating with as the SAG president, Gorbachev and the sort of the bureaucrats in the Soviet Union were not a match for him. So he used that to his advantage, but he always negotiated from strength. That's the thing, if I were in the Trump administration, is recommending that they think through where do we have strength and where do we have weaknesses. One weakness is we are not active in the sort of the early end of the supply chain. Right? We can put a lot of controls on the highest tech assembly products and systems with the help of the Dutch and some other countries who are allies of us whose companies make most sophisticated goods. Those partnerships will hold up, and there are lots of sources globally for some of these materials, but we're not mining them and processing them in the U.S. Okay, we sort of outsource the dirty work, and that's coming back somewhat to haunt us. Now, Bill, you're right that these products are available elsewhere and are mined elsewhere, and markets will respond. But it's something that, given our share of the Earth's crust is roughly the same as China, and the U.S. Geological Survey knows where these materials are within the continental United States, and nothing has to be invented to go mine and process them. We got to think about whether we want to participate in that end of the business as well, mostly to project the strength that I think negotiations with China will take.
That latter point is a really good one, because I think we have not wanted to participate in that part of it. Combination of environmental concerns and NIMBYism, not in my backyard. These processing facilities are dirty, messy, space-consuming, and not really welcome in most neighborhoods. I can tell you my neighborhood wouldn't be very happy to have one. And we have been content over the years to have that end of the supply chain process take place in other countries and let them deal with all the dust and all the dirt. And what we sort of are ending up learning is that may not be a wise strategy if we want to avoid choke points and if we want to avoid countries that engage in economic coercion, of which China is a good example. How we'll deal with that remains to be seen, because this is like turning the direction of the battleship. It's not something that you do on a dime and overnight. The permitting process in the United States, which has been a source of controversy for a good while, guarantees that this is going to take a long time. Congress keeps threatening to address that, but never gets quite to the finish line. Trump has many times said he intends to address it, so we'll see if that happens. But even so, I think there are also limits on how far the federal government can go, because some of this devolves into state and local, particularly local zoning regulations and local permitting processes. But, if you want to have secure, resilient supply chains, you've either got to get over those humps and do it domestically, or you've got to do what we here at the Shoal Chair have been recommending, which is enter into more trusted trade partnerships.
Right.
Do, in other words, friend shoring. Find countries that don't practice economic coercion and then form relationships with them. If I can just rant on one more minute, the Exim Bank just announced a very interesting new program, Critical Minerals Initiative, in which they're going to finance critical minerals projects in foreign countries. And it's unique in the Exim Bank portfolio because it's financing that's not tied specifically to an export. Basically, it's tied to an import. It's tied to a contract between the importing U.S. entity and the critical minerals producer somewhere else, and it's contingent on that contract existing. But it's a way to develop critical minerals resilient supply chains and have the government be a financing enabler of that. Very creative on the part of the bank. We'll see how far it gets.
Yes, it may help save the Ex-Im Bank. Who knows?
Yes, I was talking to a reporter about that this morning, and we were both wondering whether this is going to be a Doge target. The bank has been a target of conservatives in the past as part of campaigns to cut spending. And why are we spending money that primarily goes to large companies, ignoring the fact that those are large companies that are exporting a lot of things that contribute to our jobs and growth in the United States. So we'll see if it ends up being a Musk and Ramaswamy Doge target or not. But this particular program, I think, is going to be quite in line with what I think Trump wants to do, which is free American producers of dependence on Chinese minerals.
Well, I think we're going to circle back to that Musk and Ramaswamy point a little later on, at least this episode, probably future episodes as well.
Many times.
But I want to stick in the realm of East Asian relations for just a minute with the story we've tracked over time, and that's Nippon Steel's attempted acquisition of U.S. Steel, which seems to be in real trouble after President Biden blocked the deal on national security grounds on January 3rd. So we know there are still some lawsuits ongoing, but if this does indeed fall through, as it looks like, what should we expect to see in terms of fallout, in terms of our relationship with Japan, as well as the status of the U.S. as a destination for foreign investment?
Well, I was going to start with a joke, but I don't think there's much of anything that's funny about this. It seems like just a complete embarrassment for the people involved. I think the United States winds up looking ridiculous. I mean, just look, act like I'm a sixth grader and explain to me in a simple declarative sentence what the national security risk is here, because I can't see it. But that aside, this is a trusted ally. We have an industry that badly needs modernization. We have a foreign firm, Nippon Steel, headquartered in Japan, that is interested in production in the U.S. Keep in mind, the reason they want to buy U.S. Steel is not because U.S. Steel is a great brand name. It is, but that's not the reason. The reason is there's a tremendous amount of money in the federal government that's being spent with Buy America steel requirements. With the infrastructure bills, the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, all this federal funds, when they buy steel, it's steel made in the U.S. They can't supply imports to meet that demand. So naturally, they want to look at domestic production. I thought domestic production was something we wanted. And what they're offering, what they offered the board, why the board of United States Steel thought the offer was good enough to present to shareholders, is they're offering advanced technology, which U.S. Steel itself does not have. That sounds like a smart thing, something we ought to want, particularly from an ally, a company that's headquartered in a treaty ally like Japan. So I can't, for the life of me, figure out what's wrong. And then, of course, we're fighting over what basically are not that big an industry. I would note that, first of all, there was a second offer from Cleveland-Cliffs to buy U.S. Steel. That had obvious antitrust problems, so that's aside. But keep in mind, the whole steel business has a lower market in the United States. All the companies in the U.S. headquartered that make steel add up their market capitalization. It's less than Starbucks, about $100 billion. Okay? At this point, U.S. Steel plus Cleveland-Cliffs is smaller than that famous meme stock, GameStop. GameStop has a greater market cap at $14 billion than U.S. Steel plus Cleveland-Cliffs. These companies aren't that big. They're kind of husks of their former selves. There's lots of reason to have an interest in U.S. domestic steel production, but why not choose an owner that's got some technology? In any case, the whole thing makes no sense. More importantly, we have a process that's supposed to be based on national security, and CFIUS has always lived and died with negotiation. Basically, as many CFIUS investigations as there are mitigation agreements. And usually, if there's a problem, it's a real national security problem or a real competitive problem, then the parties sign a mitigation agreement and the thing goes forward. So it's like, what are we doing? We need the money. This seems like a great deal for shareholders, better than the alternatives. It's good for U.S. production. And by the way, we're treating an ally very badly. I don't think we treat our enemies as badly as we just treated Japan. So it's like when the guys at the Animal House brought back Flounders Brothers Lincoln Continental and trashed it, Otter basically said, well, you screwed up. You trusted us. And I feel like that's how we're treating Japan. I don't see any bright spot here. Bill, I'm probably missing something, but this is just ridiculous.
Well, nice rant, Scott. And I'm not going to have one. I'm more sad than upset about this. People who followed my career know I've spent a lot of time on the steel industry in the past when I was working for the senator from Pennsylvania and watched the steel industry over a very long time. And I'm sad because I agree with Scott. There's a win-win outcome here.
Right.
And it was missed. I said from the beginning a year ago that this would only happen if the Steelworkers Union blessed the agreement and came out and said, we are for it. You should vote for it. You should ratify it. It's good for the workers. And that became a necessity because so many politicians immediately out of the starting blocks said, I'm against it. Iconic American company needs American ownership. So the senators from Ohio, the senators from Pennsylvania, now the president-elect, when he was a candidate, all said the same thing. So they dug themselves into a hole. And the only way they could get out of it was if the union ended up saying, this is really a good thing to do, and you guys should change your mind. And that didn't happen. And I'm not entirely sure why it didn't happen. It seemed to me that, at least on paper, the company, Nippon, was offering the workers pretty much what they wanted. And the union's response was more or less, we don't trust them to deliver. Well, okay, maybe they don't. I mean, that's basically saying there's no agreement that will be acceptable if you don't trust the other party. I think if this debate had been going on in the 80s, when we were at odds with Japan on a whole bunch of things, a lot of people would have agreed with that. But that was then, this is now. They're not in the same economic position that they were then, vis-a-vis us. They're a trusted ally and a friend. And Scott's right, we've insulted them, and that will have consequences down the road. But I'm a little bit baffled as to why the union didn't enter into serious, sustained negotiations with the company that could have led to an outcome that was better. I was struck by the fact that as this played out over time, more and more workers in the old plants in U.S. Steel, meaning the Pennsylvania plants primarily, more and more of those workers began to line up in favor of this deal, along with local government officials in those communities who were saying, we need this. This is the way to save our jobs. This is the way to save the company. So the workers actually are divided. I don't know that it's 50-50 split, but they're not unanimously behind the union leadership. But right now it appears to be dead. There is a theory that I think is being propagated by the people who would still want the deal to go through, that in an ironic twist of fate, there's an opportunity here for Donald Trump to be a hero. That is to come in and save the day by saying, I'm going to negotiate a better deal. I'm a better deal maker than anybody in the world, and I'm going to go off and talk to the Nippon, and I'm going to get you guys, you steel workers, a better deal. And then he goes off and does what he does and comes back and says, I've got a good deal for you guys. This is a better deal than what was on the table for Biden, and I think you should support it, and I'm going to support it. I don't think the odds of that happening are very good, but if you think about it, I can see Trump being willing to contemplate it because he's a deal maker.
Yeah, this is a bad result for the other team.
Yeah.
If he can fix it, that's all the better for him.
Well, and plus, the steel workers that were against this agreement were the leadership.
Mm-hmm.
They're the people that endorsed Biden.
Yeah.
Trump doesn't owe them anything. My guess is that most of the actual steel workers voted for Trump. So politically, I think he's on safe ground. The workers aren't going to complain if he approves it.
That's for
the
sure.
leadership will complain, but they endorse the other guy.
Right.
So stay tuned. As I said, I'm skeptical. It's probably a bridge too far, but if it happens, listeners, you heard it here first.
Well, that's something to look forward to. I agree with you. The chance is fairly small, but it would certainly help restore American dignity in things like having a system that runs on the rule of law instead of the whim of politicians.
Glad you said rule of law, because one more subtopic here. This is going to be litigated. Nippon and U.S. Steel are suing the government. They're also suing the union and Cleveland-Cliffs CEO personally.
Oh, wow.
For conspiring to tank the deal. That one's court in Pennsylvania. The suit against the government is in, I think, the Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit here in Washington. It'll be interesting to see how this plays out. My view is there's a precedent here, the Rawls case, which involved a wind farm in the northwestern part of the country that was located near an Air Force base, where the acquisition, which was Chinese in that case, was rejected by President Obama. And there the parties sued as well. And that went all the way to the Supreme Court.
Mm-hmm.
And what the Supreme said was they dinged the president on a process foul. They said he did not follow the proper rules that are laid out for CFIUS. Specifically, in that case, they didn't give the parties the information from the other side that they were supposed to give. But the Supreme has also said the decision itself is not subject to judicial review, and that the law is clear about that. So the result basically was the administration had to go back and do it again and follow the rules. Same decision, same outcome. And my guess is that will happen again this time around. They can probably successfully argue that the administration committed a process foul, the most obvious piece of which was when Biden preempted the process last March by saying, I don't think this should be approved. I think ownership should continue to be American. I think it's pretty easy to argue that he poisoned the well as far as the bureaucracy is concerned. But the bottom line remains the president's decision is the president's decision. And the justices in a previous case said that they're not in a position to review that on the merits. So I think that absent Trump doing something, the decision stands.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe they'll have to go back and do it again. Actually, if they have to go back and do it again, because of what I just said a few minutes ago, maybe there will be a different decision. That would be interesting.
Yeah, meantime, it all gives all sorts of time to the deal maker Donald Trump has done a lot of things in his career. This guy got concrete delivered to Manhattan at 3 a.m. He's done some things in this end of the business that make him a candidate for being able to at least look at it differently. Whether he can solve it or not remains to be seen.
Exactly.
We'll keep an eye on that. And if Bill does wind up being right, we'll be sure to remind you all.
Yeah, perpetually.
Yes.
If I'm right about something, I won't let anybody forget it. It happens so rarely that I need to take advantage of the opportunity.
Absolutely. So let's wrap with a debate that we alluded to earlier, which made a lot of headlines last week because of a very public spat over the fate of H1B visas within certain parts of the president-elect's coalition. So guys, what are the origins of this dispute and what impacts might a change in immigration policy have on the U.S. economy?
Well, like a lot of things, this is complicated. The debate seems to be particularly about H1B visas, which allows companies to hire foreign workers for specialized jobs. Usually they need to demonstrate that they can't find American workers to fill the jobs. And the program tends to be heavily used by high-tech companies who want to hire engineers, skilled foreign workers, particularly in STEM fields, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. A lot of the semiconductor companies will hire people to work on coding and on semiconductor design and manufacturing that are foreign workers. By the way, just to digress for a second, if you're interested in this issue, not just H-1Bs, but immigration in general, the Scholl Chair just produced a paper on immigration last December. We had an event on this, both of which are available on our website, that talks about the worker shortage we have, not just in STEM workers, but in all workers. And we look specifically at other sectors, construction, health, transportation, and agriculture. But we don't have enough workers. And demography is not our friend in this case. We have an aging population and a declining birth rate. Our birth rate is below the replacement rate. And if you think about it long term, all the workers in 2040 have been born already. We know what that number is, and we know it's not going to be enough. And there's only one answer in that situation. We can have more babies, but they're not going to be of working age by 2040. The answer is going to be immigration. And we make a variety of proposals about what to do about that. The H-1B issue, though, actually all immigration issues, kicked off a fairly vigorous debate about whether the effect of visa programs like this end up denying Americans jobs. And in this particular case, it's interesting because it's become a debate really between two sets of Trump supporters. Mm-hmm. You've got essentially, I guess, the economic nationalists, probably led by Stephen Miller, who has a high-ranking position inside the administration, who are saying we need to deport more people, we need to not let so many people in, we need to make sure that there's room for Americans to take all these jobs, even though there's more jobs available than there are unemployed people to take them. And even though in the H1B case, we pretty clearly don't have enough Americans qualified to fill those positions. I think Miller's answer is, well, skills training and education and things like that, which is not wrong, but it's also not immediate. These things take time. The other side of that debate point person lately has been Elon Musk, who has a background in the tech sector, as everybody knows, who's saying we need more of these people, and we can't find them here in the United States. And we need a program like the H1B program that lets these people in. And other people are kind of standing around watching with some bemusement as two branches of the right wing go at it. Trump, most recently, more or less came down on Musk's side. So it will be interesting to see how this plays out as they develop their immigration plans and their deportation plans. I mean, it appears that, the top priority list is to go after people with criminal records, which not entirely, but for the most part means people who don't have STEM skills, but are lower skilled workers with criminal backgrounds. So I'm not sure what it means for the H1B program. I think one could argue that from the standpoint of both branches of the right wing, they could both have their cake and eat it too. Musk could get the kind of STEM workers that he wants and needs, and the economic populace can get their way with massive deportation. But right now, it's a fairly bitter fight. Scott?
Well, yes, it is. But there's a couple of things to like about this fight. First, just in terms of the importance of migration or immigration to the United States, no question that the U.S. economic problem has almost always been too much resources and not enough people. In the early days, we had way too much land, not enough people. Europe had the opposite problem, too many people, not enough land. So it balanced. That was the pre-industrial America. But even today, we all know, and I experienced this personally, there are bright, intelligent, inventive, creative people all over the world. The only way that you can take advantage of their genius, there are two ways. One is you let them come here and be geniuses here, or you allow them to import their products so you can enjoy the products. So it's either immigration or trade, and both are useful. Both are good for the economy. In this particular case, here's what I thought was constructive about the debate. First, it was the first immigration debate that I've observed in a long time where nobody called the other guy a racist, which I thought was healthy. The second thing is they clearly identified the positions involved and got very specific about whether H1B visa was a workaround from a failure to properly recruit and develop American talent or not, and whether the H1B visa program actually worked as intended. And here's one where I don't often agree with the senator from Vermont, but Bernie Sanders wants to reform H1B visas. And he wants to reform them because he thinks they're bad for workers. And they put workers in very difficult, the H1B workers themselves. So I would use that as a sign that while the H1B visa process and policy is potentially useful, it's not without flaws. It doesn't just get the top software engineers. Okay, there's a lot of people on H1B visas who are somewhat sort of semi-skilled in many ways. So that was the product. And I think the Stephen Miller's side of the argument, if that's his, I don't know his personal point of view, but the sort of restrictionist arguments both have merit because they come from the point of view that, look, we are a self-governed country, and who comes here and works ought to be something we have a say in. It's a very populist argument, but it's not wrong in a society that purports to govern itself, okay, where the people are in charge. Second, there's a lot we can do to develop partnerships with universities, partnerships with high schools to get the talent we need. It's not fast, but nothing's fast, but it can be done. Recently, the small college I went to in Ohio has a great record of placing graduates. One of the reasons we have an engineering school, which we just built a new building so we could produce more engineers, which is a good thing. But also the highest placement program in the entire university is in manufacturing technology, what used to be called industrial arts. And believe it or not, they have a 100% placement rate the last 10 years. So there is demand for graduates with the right set of skills, right? And working with local employers, which is what this program does, finds jobs for Americans. All I'm saying is not easy, but I understand why the arguments can be made that H1B looks like a workaround for the tech bros, so they don't have to worry about developing Americans. Be that as it may, it was an argument where the policy arguments were made in good faith, and I think ultimately there will be middle ground found, because Bill's point that he made at the outset is right. We need the workers. We need people who can do these jobs. They probably aren't all here in the U.S. today, and that does not interfere with a policy that also says if you have people who are not legally present and have criminal records, that they ought to be deported. That's a whole different story, and you can maintain both those points of view at once. So I'm glad to see people talking about the issue, and we'll talk about it a lot more before anything gets done, but that's the track we're on.
An optimistic note from Scott to wrap for this week. We will see you next week as we prepare for Trump 2.0 and what promises to be a very busy next couple of months. So thank you, Scott. Thank you, Bill. See you later.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Welcome to the new year.
To our listeners, if you have a question for the Trade Guys, write us at tradeguys@csis.org. That's tradeguys@csis.org. We'll read some of your emails and have the Trade Guys react to it. You've been listening to The Trade Guys, a CSIS podcast.